Hi everyone, Kristina here. Welcome to another card video at my YouTube channel and blog. Today I'm going to be using this stamp set from Gina K Designs called Geo Thanks. I'm going to be using that heart in that top corner, as well as a little greeting stamp to finish it off. I'm starting out with some watercolor paper that I've kept on the block, meaning that all four sides, with the exception of a corner, are gummed. So I normally would not have to tape this down. Now, I discovered as I was painting, and you'll see this, that if you're going to be doing a watercolor piece that is very heavily coated in water, if it's got a lot of water, a ton of water, you're probably best removing your watercolor paper from the block and taping it down to a hard board. I did do a background previous to the one you're seeing, and with that one I did tape it down to a hardboard and it dried much flatter. It didn't have any warping issues or hills and valleys where the paint collected in. So I'll mention that as we go along here, but the paints I'm using today are from Winsor & Newton. I have a set of watercolors that I bought a few years ago, and I realized I hadn't used them in a long time, so I thought I'd break them out. So I've started out with a pink color going to the orange and then to the yellow, and I'm lifting up this block of watercolor paper so that it forces the paints to move around. I want them to spread. So when I started painting, I knew that those colors were going to spread, that I wanted them to do that. So I only added a small amount of color because I wanted there to be room for it to grow and really move beyond that area where I painted. So that area that's kind of going out of control up there, I was able to rein that in with my paintbrush. I just sort of moved the color back up. And that just shows you how wet this watercolor paper is. There's a ton of water on there. So I'm adding some more of this blue shade. This is, I think it's called cobalt turquoise or something like that. And this color actually has quite a bit of pigment in it, and it doesn't spread quite as much as the other colors. So you will see that it has some granulation and the pigment settling into the texture of the watercolor paper. Not a huge deal, just something to be aware of if you don't particularly like it. It's not my favorite, but I love the color. I'm going to add even more water by spraying with my Distress spray bottle, and I'm getting more water in there and then lifting it up and getting these colors to really move around. And I'm trying to make sure that the colors don't mix too much because then they'll just create mud on my project. But I still wanted the colors to move. So this is kind of like a delicate balance you have to have, trying to get everything to move, rotating that paper all around and picking it up with the paper towel. Now that bottom edge of the color, you'll notice that it's all collecting. That's because there was a big valley in my watercolor paper. And I'll lift up my watercolor block here in a minute and you'll be able to see how much of like hill and valleys and warping I created when I added so much water to this watercolor piece. And I really think that if I had taped this down to a hardboard, I wouldn't have had that issue. If you guys can hear a cat meowing back here, that would be Sophie. Hi, Soph. It's just about dinner time for her, so she's reminding me that she needs to be fed. So I did use a paper towel and dabbed up some of that color because I just wanted to keep it from spreading too much. And then I tipped it like this. You can kind of see the warping in the paper there, but I loved how the colors were starting to move toward the bottom of the piece here. So I kept my watercolor paper tilted. And when I thought it was just about where I wanted it to stop, I grabbed my heat tool and started drying it. Now, when you dry your watercolor piece, that will stop the colors moving. And since I got it to where I wanted it to be, it was time to start drying it. I removed it from the block and then continued drying it some more. And then eventually I moved on to the stamping. I'm using my MISTI stamp positioning tool because I'm going to be stamping this heart stamp 3 times. And that's because I'm going to be heat embossing. And I stamped it 3 times so that I would have a really solid impression. Prepped that area with an anti-static powder tool, and then inked up the stamp with a Versamark ink. And like I said before, I'm going to stamp this multiple times. The reason you do this is because of the texture of the watercolor paper and how fine-lined the image is. that texture of the watercolor paper really doesn't let you get a really solid line unless you stamp it multiple times. So I stamped it 3 times to make sure that I had a really solid line. And I'm glad I did, because when it came to the embossing, it worked out beautifully. I'm applying some white embossing powder. This is alabaster embossing powder from Brutus Monroe. Just sprinkled that on and kind of tapped my paper to shake off the excess. And before I heat set this, since my greeting was going to fit right inside of that heart, I decided to go ahead and stamp that greeting. And once again, I stamped it 3 times, and then I can apply the embossing powder and then heat set the heart and the stamped greeting all at the same time. So this is going to be a little bit more efficient. So I'll use my heat tool, and I'm only heating this until I can see that it's melted. You don't want to heat it too much because you run the risk of that embossing powder melting into that highly textured watercolor paper. I trimmed down my watercolor piece so that it was 5 inches tall by 3 3/4 wide. And then I prepared my card base, which is made out of some Neenah Solar White 110-pound cardstock. Scored that at 5 1/2 to create a top folding card. And then I put foam adhesive on the back of my watercolor panel and pressed it down onto the card front. To finish this off, I'm using my absolutely favorite sequins. You guys will already know this if you've been watching my videos for, I don't know, the last 4 or 5 years, because that's how long I've used these. These are the crystal sequins from Doris. These take on whatever color is right below them. They're absolutely fantastic for multicolored pieces like this. You can see all that sparkle. So that is the card for today. Hope you guys enjoyed. I love rainbow cards like this because I just love everything colorful. Thanks so much for watching. I'll be back on Friday with a card featuring the new card kit from Simon Says Stamp.